The man history tried to erase. There are secrets powerful enough to decide wars. And there are men so invisible that history itself pretends they never existed. This is the story of one such man. A man who wore chains on his wrists while holding the fate of a nation in his mind. A slave who walked between armies. A shadow who whispered truths that generals could not see. His intelligence helped decide the American Revolution. When the war ended and victory songs filled the streets, his name vanished. No statue, no medal, no grave marked with honor. He died the way he lived. Forgotten, erased, but the truth never truly dies. It waits, buried in silence, waiting to be uncovered, and when uncovered, it reveals something darker and more dangerous than the heroic stories we were taught. This is not a story of glory. This is a story of survival, and of a man who changed history while the world looked straight through him. The plantation in New Kent County, Virginia stretched across the land like a kingdom built on suffering. 300 acres of rich tobacco soil. 63 enslaved human beings. All legally classified as property. The main house stood tall and white with wide columns and clean windows. It looked peaceful from a distance. But beneath its beauty was cruelty. Every brick and beam was paid for with broken backs and stolen lives. James was born there around 1760. No one recorded the exact date. Slave births were not celebrated. They were written into ledgers like livestock. A name if you were lucky. A gender. An estimated value. His mother was a house servant named Ruth. Quiet, watchful, strong in ways that never showed on her face. His father was a field worker whose name James never knew. He was sold to a South Carolina plantation before James could remember his voice. Ruth raised her son with a careful kind of love. The kind enslaved mothers learned to master. Love mixed with fear, love shaped by reality. She taught him lessons that could save his life. Never look white people in the eyes too long. Never show anger. Never reveal what you are thinking. Your face had to lie even when your heart screamed. One night in their dark cabin she held him close and whispered words he never forgot. You got a sharp mind, baby. But you must hide it. A slave with a mind scares them. Keep it locked away. One day it might save you. James listened. And James learned. He learned that plantations were not simple places. They were dangerous systems with hidden rules. Knowing those rules meant survival. Breaking them meant pain or death. He learned which overseers were cruel and which were monsters. He learned which house servants could be trusted and which whispered to the master. He learned to read William Armistead's moods like weather. Calm days, storm days, drunk and dangerous days. William Armistead believed himself to be a good man. He read books about liberty. He spoke of natural rights. He claimed slavery troubled his conscience. Yet every morning he woke up and owned human beings. He beat slaves less often than others. He fed them just enough. He called himself enlightened. The contradiction never seemed to bother him. Life on the plantation moved in endless cycles. Bells at dawn, cornmeal mush for breakfast, long days in the tobacco fields. Planting, growing, harvesting, curing, then again, and again. James's childhood disappeared into that rhythm. But James was different. While other children played when they could, James watched. He watched how orders were given. How fear controlled bodies. How silence protected lives. He listened when house servants whispered about business and politics. He learned without books. Teaching slaves to read was illegal. But James learned to read people. He learned to read tension. To read desire. To read fear. He remembered everything. By his teenage years his value increased. He was moved from the fields to the stables. He cared for horses. Repaired tools. Delivered messages to nearby plantations. He earned limited movement, limited trust. And with that movement came information. The outside world began creeping in through whispers. Taxes, protests, parliament, rebellion. Names like Stamp Act and Townshend Acts floated through dinner conversations James was not meant to hear. In 1775 guns fired in Massachusetts. Lexington, Concord. The words sounded distant but powerful. In 1776 men declared independence while standing on land worked by slaves. White men spoke of freedom while holding chains. James noticed the contradiction immediately. And he understood something important. A nation arguing with itself is unstable. And instability creates opportunity. When British forces moved into Virginia, everything changed. The king's commanders offered freedom to enslaved people who escaped and joined them. Thousands ran. The plantation emptied. Fear spread. William Armistead raged. He tightened control, increased punishments, Made examples. James watched the runaways disappear into the unknown. Part of him wanted to run too. But another part asked a harder question. What happens after the war? Freedom offered in war is a weapon. And weapons are often discarded. In 1781 war arrived in New Kent County. British troops under Benedict Arnold burned through Virginia. Continental forces followed close behind. The plantation became a resting point for armies. Soldiers slept where slaves once slept. Boots crushed the same dirt that had crushed James's childhood. And then James met the man who would change everything. The Marquis de Lafayette was young, idealistic, burning with belief, a French noble fighting for American liberty. He believed deeply, almost dangerously. By spring of 1781 Lafayette commanded forces in Virginia. He was outnumbered, undersupplied, surrounded by enemies. His greatest weakness was ignorance. He needed information, and James had been collecting it his entire life. Standing in the shadows, listening, waiting, history would soon move through him. And no one would ever know his name. If you want to uncover the truth history tried to erase and follow this dark journey through war secrets and forgotten heroes, make sure to subscribe to the channel, share this story, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps these hidden stories alive. Part 2. The Spy Who Could Not Exist. Wars are not won only by guns and blood. They are won by whispers. By secrets passed in shadows. By men who walk into death pretending they belong there. In 1781 Virginia, one wrong word could mean a rope around your neck. And one forgotten face could change the fate of a nation. James was about to become that forgotten face. For the Marquis de Lafayette, information was more valuable than ammunition. Cannons meant nothing if you did not know where to aim them. Soldiers were useless if you did not know where the enemy was moving. Lafayette was fighting blind, and blind commanders do not survive long. British forces controlled most of Virginia. Roads were watched, towns were occupied, loyalists informed on anyone who looked suspicious. Continental scouts were captured within hours. Tortured, executed, but Lafayette understood something others did not. The most powerful intelligence gatherers were the people no one saw. Enslaved Africans moved across the land unnoticed. A slave walking between plantations raised no alarm. A slave approaching British camps claiming to seek freedom was expected, encouraged, almost welcomed. Lafayette had used black spies before. And they had saved his army more than once. He trusted them more than many white officers. They were not fighting for ideas written on paper. They were fighting for their lives. When Continental forces camped near the Armistead plantation in late March of 1781, Lafayette requested dinner with William Armistead. The plantation owner agreed eagerly, proud to host a famous French general. They ate beneath chandeliers built with slave labor. They spoke of liberty while enslaved servants stood silent against the walls. Lafayette questioned the contradiction openly. How could a nation cry for freedom while holding others in chains? Armistead replied with practiced excuses. Slavery was inherited, necessary, temporary, humane. Lafayette listened but did not argue. He needed something else. I am told you own an enslaved man named James. Intelligent, observant, familiar with this region. Armistead stiffened slightly. Yes, capable worker. I would like to speak with him. Regarding a matter important to the Continental cause. What followed was not a request. It was a transaction. Armistead did not want to risk losing valuable property. But he wanted to look patriotic. Lafayette hinted that loyalty might be remembered when independence came. Land, influence, favor. The message was clear. James would be loaned to the revolution. James was not consulted. He was informed. That night he lay awake on his thin pallet staring into darkness. His mother was gone. He had no family tying him down. Fear pressed against his chest. But beneath it was something else. Purpose. Morning arrived cold and gray. James walked to the Continental camp with careful posture. Respectful, invisible, 20 years old but worn beyond his age. Lafayette received him inside a canvas tent smelling of oil and damp cloth. Maps covered the table. The general gestured for him to sit. James hesitated. Slaves did not sit unless ordered twice. I will stand, sir. Lafayette studied him closely. Not as property, as possibility. Your master says you are intelligent and discreet. I do what I am told and I keep my mouth closed. That is not enough for what I need. Lafayette leaned forward. I need someone who can think. Someone who can remember details without writing. Someone who can lie well enough to survive. James felt his pulse quicken but his face stayed calm. You would enter British camps pretending to be a runaway slave. You would serve them, listen to them, watch everything. Troop numbers, Supply shortages, officer arguments, plans whispered at night. You would remember it all. And bring it back to me. James swallowed. And if they find out, they will hang you. No trial, no mercy. The words landed heavy but honest. If I refuse, you return to your master. Though he may not appreciate your lack of patriotism. A choice with teeth. James thought of his mother's words. Hide your mind. One day it might save you. He looked at Lafayette. If I do this, if I survive, what happens to me? Lafayette paused. I cannot promise freedom, but I will recommend it. Strongly. It was not justice, but it was more hope than James had ever been offered. He nodded once. I will do it. Training began immediately, quietly. At night, Lafayette taught him how to memorize maps by walking them in his mind. How to listen without staring. How to repeat information backward to lock it into memory. James learned British ranks, uniform markings, accents, how officers spoke when relaxed, how they spoke when afraid. He learned how to appear slow without being stupid, how to be useful but not impressive. After 3 days, Lafayette gave him his cover story. A slave fleeing a cruel master. Seeking British freedom, hungry, loyal to the crown. British patrols encountered him near the James River. They questioned him, prodded him, threatened him. James cried when expected, trembled when demanded, said exactly what they wanted to hear. They believed him. Inside the British camp he became invisible again. Carrying water, cleaning boots, serving food, listening. He heard officers argue over supply shortages. Heard complaints about unreliable loyalists. Heard whispers of troop movements toward Yorktown. At night he lay awake memorizing every word. Weeks passed. He made his first report through a trusted courier. Lafayette adjusted his positions accordingly. British advances failed unexpectedly. Traps were avoided. The enemy could not understand how the rebels always knew. James moved between camps like a ghost. Between armies. Between worlds. Living on the edge of death. Every day he expected the rope. But he also felt something new. Power. History was moving through him. And no one noticed. If you want to continue this forgotten story of danger and deception and uncover the man history erased, make sure to subscribe to the channel, share this video, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps bring these hidden stories back into the light. Part 3. Walking among enemies. Fear is a companion that never leaves a spy. It sits in your chest, whispers in your ear, tightens your stomach. But courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is moving forward while the fear is there. James was about to discover that every step could mean life or death. And in that dangerous world, one mistake could erase everything he had learned. If he succeeded, he might change the course of the war. If he failed, he would vanish without a trace. And no one would mourn him. Not the generals, not the officers, not the nation he was risking everything to save. James had trained for days, memorizing routines, conversations, and landscapes. Captain Benjamin Haynes had drilled him in every scenario. How to answer questions convincingly. How to appear harmless while gathering critical intelligence. How to hide his mind behind a mask that could survive the most dangerous scrutiny. Now it was real. The British camp at Portsmouth loomed ahead. Earthworks rose like walls of judgment. Redcoats patrolled the fences, bayonets glinting in the weak spring sunlight. Hessian mercenaries walked among them, disciplined and deadly. Loyalist scouts checked everyone who passed through the checkpoints. Every detail James had memorized came alive. He remembered Haynes's lessons. Slow movements. No sudden gestures. Speak with nervous gratitude. Never act too clever. Never hesitate. 2 sentries stepped forward. Stop there. State your business. James froze for a fraction of a second, long enough for his pulse to pound in his ears. Then he straightened, projecting every ounce of fear he had trained to show. Seeking to join His Majesty's forces, sir. I am a runaway from a rebel plantation. I heard the British would give freedom to those who come over. The men exchanged glances, familiar with hundreds of similar stories. Another one, they muttered to each other. The first soldier eyed James. Where you from? Armistead Plantation, New Kent County, sir. Why now? Master was talking about selling some of us to cover debts, sir. I figured I'd rather take my chances with British freedom than end up on some Georgia plantation where they work you to death. The soldier nodded. You got skills. James forced a weak smile. I do what is asked, sir. I run errands, tend animals, help with repairs. I am quick to learn, sir. The soldiers scrutinized him but said nothing more. James passed through the checkpoint, heart racing, palms dry despite the spring chill. He had survived the first test. But the real danger lay ahead. Inside the camp, James blended among laborers, cooks, and other runaway slaves. He carried water, cleaned tools, and moved supplies. Every motion was careful, rehearsed, precise. Every glance was calculated. He listened, he observed, he remembered. Officers argued over supply shortages. They complained about delays, missing wagons, and unreliable loyalists. James memorized every number, every route, every shipment. He mapped fortifications in his mind, noted the strengths of the artillery, the positions of sentries, the rotations of patrols. He repeated the patterns over and over, filing details into mental compartments. Haynes's training had given him techniques to retain complex information under stress. He counted without obvious counting. He estimated distances, memorized troop formations, and encoded every observation into stories in his head. When officers questioned him, he answered carefully. He used truth as the spine of his lies. His experience on the plantation had taught him how to give exactly what people expected while hiding what he truly knew. Every answer was believable. Every story seemed spontaneous. Weeks passed. Each day brought new tests. James delivered messages, cleaned stables, cooked meals. Each task provided opportunities to observe. Each small conversation, each overheard word, added pieces to the puzzle he was building in his mind. At night, he reported through the network Lafayette had arranged. Couriers met him at secluded spots. Information passed from James to Lafayette. Sometimes it was about troop movements. Sometimes it was about supply lines. Sometimes it was about officers plotting or arguing. Every report mattered. Every detail could save lives. Or cost them. James had learned patience. He learned to control his fear, to use it like a tool rather than a chain. The thrill of power was subtle, almost invisible. He was invisible among enemies. He could see them, know them, manipulate what they thought they knew about him. And he was changing in ways he never expected. The boy who had learned to hide on a plantation to survive was now a man who could make survival an instrument of war. One day, he overheard a discussion that would alter the next campaign. British officers debated reinforcements, redoubt positions, supply shortages. James memorized the locations, the timing, the vulnerabilities. Every number precise, every detail stored. He repeated it to the courier at night. Lafayette adjusted troop movements. A trap was avoided. Lives were saved. And yet, despite the victories, James remained invisible. Nobody knew the shadow moving among British soldiers was the same man shaping the Continental Army's strategy. History would forget him. That fact did not matter. Survival and the mission came first. James discovered another truth. The mask he wore was not just for the British. It protected him from a world that could never see him as fully human. Every lie he told was a shield. Every act of obedience was a weapon. And the more he practiced, the more natural it became. He could enter a room, hear a dozen conversations, memorize formations, map positions, and appear entirely passive. Years of slavery had trained him without his knowing. Observation had been survival. Now observation was power. The British never noticed the subtle glances, the small questions, the thoughts he recorded and filed away. Their arrogance made them blind. But danger never left him. A single misstep could mean the rope, the gallows, the end of everything. Every day, he felt the weight of his choice, the constant presence of fear, the burden of knowing that the fate of others rested on his memory and cunning. One evening, a British officer questioned him repeatedly, trying variations of the same questions to detect inconsistencies. James answered carefully. Every response aligned with the cover story. Every story seemed natural, unrehearsed. When the officer left, James exhaled silently. His heart still pounded, but he knew he had passed the test. He was learning to live in two worlds. To serve openly while secretly controlling the flow of critical intelligence. To be submissive in appearance while commanding information in reality. And Lafayette was relying on him more each day. The war raged on, but James had become the shadow that could tip the balance. Invisible, dangerous, unseen by history, but indispensable to the fight for freedom. If you want to see how this invisible spy walked through death and gathered secrets that could win wars, make sure to subscribe, share this story, and leave your thoughts in the comments. These are the stories history forgot, and your support keeps them alive. Part 4. Among Shadows and Betrayal. The night was dark and heavy, carrying the smell of wet earth and smoke from distant campfires. Fear was a living thing, creeping along James's spine, whispering that one wrong word could end everything. But fear was also clarity. Fear made him sharper. Fear made him invisible. Inside the British camp, James had learned to move like a ghost. He could walk past soldiers without their noticing him. He could overhear conversations meant to be private. He could memorize the layout of a fortress while appearing to sweep the courtyard. Every motion, every glance, every word he spoke had to seem ordinary, harmless, predictable. The British officers trusted him. They believed he was just another runaway slave seeking freedom. They believed he was desperate and grateful. They believed he was simple. And that belief was his weapon. One evening, James overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Two officers argued quietly near the armory. They spoke of a secret shipment arriving from New York, cannons, gunpowder, and provisions meant for Yorktown. The timing, the route, the vulnerability of the transport, every detail was critical. James's mind worked quickly. Every detail had to be remembered without a mistake. One error could mean lives lost, the war delayed, or his own death. He filed the information in the mental system Haynes had taught him, encoding the numbers into stories, the locations into images, the timing into sequences of familiar objects. He carried water to the officers, served them food, and kept his posture low, his eyes cautious. Every interaction was a performance, every smile measured. That night, he found a secluded spot near the perimeter to meet a continental courier. Words were exchanged quietly. James recounted the shipment, the route, the men guarding it, and the schedule. The courier nodded, memorized the information, and disappeared into the night. James felt a rush of satisfaction. He was invisible, yet indispensable. He was dangerous, yet unseen. He was part of something far larger than himself. But he also felt a weight. Every secret he carried was a burden, a knife pressed against his mind and heart. One misstep could destroy everything. The following days tested him in ways he had never imagined. British officers moved reinforcements, planned raids, and debated strategies. James listened to them all, memorizing troop strengths, camp locations, and potential weaknesses. He walked among them carrying buckets, cleaning stables, tending horses, but every glance, every word, every gesture was observed, filed away, and recalled with perfect clarity. One afternoon, a British officer approached him unexpectedly. "Where are you from, really?" The question sounded casual, but James recognized the underlying threat. A single slip, and his life could end. "Armistead Plantation, New Kent County, sir. Master was selling some of us, sir. I thought I might be better off with your army." The officer studied him for a long moment, then shrugged and moved on. James exhaled. Slowly, he had survived another test. But the danger was constant. Every patrol, every inspection, every casual conversation could expose him. He learned to sense suspicion, to detect when a glance lingered too long. He adjusted his story, his posture, even his breathing to avoid detection. At night, he returned to his hidden spot to record the day's observations mentally. He visualized the camp, placing officers, supply wagons, tents, and artillery in precise locations in his mind. Every detail mattered. Every number, every route, every schedule could change the outcome of the war. One morning, James witnessed something that made him question loyalty and trust. A fellow runaway slave had been captured attempting to sneak intelligence to the Continental forces. The British hanged him publicly, a warning to others. James watched from the shadows, heart hammering, stomach tight. Fear and reality collided. His choices carried life and death consequences. That night, James thought of his mother. "Keep your mind hidden," she had said. "Use it to survive." Survival was no longer just about escaping beatings or labor. Survival was now about navigating a world where your intelligence could kill you if exposed. He realized that the mask he wore had become part of him. His obedience was no longer just pretense. It was armor. His humility was now a weapon. His fear was a tool. Every instinct, every habit cultivated on the plantation now served a purpose beyond survival, it served war itself. A week later, James overheard another crucial piece of intelligence. British officers discussed reinforcements heading toward a rebel supply depot. If the Continental forces were caught unaware, hundreds of men could die. James memorized routes, timing, and the number of soldiers involved. His mind mapped every possibility, every contingency, every risk. The courier arrived that night. James relayed the information in careful detail, hiding nothing. The courier nodded and left as silently as he had come. James remained crouched, listening to the night, imagining the officers unaware of how close their plans had come to being undone. James had become a shadow that could change the war. Invisible to the British, invisible to history, yet shaping events with every observation, every decision, every memory stored carefully in his mind. He moved like a ghost, thinking like a general, yet pretending to be a simple runaway. But shadows are never safe forever. Suspicion lingered, random questions, prolonged glances, and minor inconsistencies could unravel everything. James learned to anticipate, to adjust, to survive. The war was not just fought on fields with cannons and muskets. It was fought in minds, in silences, in shadows. One evening, he found himself near a British officer arguing with a subordinate over the accuracy of a troop report. James memorized the disagreement, noting weaknesses in communication, the officer's tendencies, the subordinate's hesitations. These details would allow Lafayette to anticipate errors and exploit them. James realized he was no longer the boy who once feared punishment for thinking too much. He had become a weapon forged by fear, discipline, and intelligence. Every day he survived, every secret he gathered, strengthened his role in a war he could never openly join. Night after night, James reflected on his mother's words, on Lafayette's advice, and on the training with Captain Haynes. He understood that his mind, once hidden to survive slavery, was now his greatest weapon. And yet, he would never be celebrated. He would remain invisible, a ghost in the story of a nation. Every day brought new challenges, new fears, new secrets. James continued to move among the British, delivering water, cleaning stables, observing movements, overhearing orders, and filing every detail into memory. The stakes were life and death, and the weight of history rested on his shoulders. The war raged around him, but James had become a force that could not be seen. He was invisible and indispensable. Every careful step, every memorized detail, every performance was a battle in itself. And yet, despite the danger, he pressed forward, driven by purpose, by survival, and by the knowledge that his mind, his hidden weapon, could turn the tide of war. If you want to see how James continued to infiltrate enemy lines, uncover secrets that could change the course of history, and survive the most dangerous mission of the American Revolution, subscribe, share this story, and leave your thoughts in the comments. History has forgotten him, but we will not. If you want, I can immediately continue with Part 5, where James begins his most dangerous intelligence mission inside British command, increasing suspense and action while keeping it historically accurate for your YouTube audience. Do you want me to do that next? Part 5. Walking into the lion's den. Some moments in life demand everything. Some moments strip you bare, leaving only your mind, your courage, and the sharpest instincts you possess. James was about to face one of those moments. Tonight, he would step deeper into British territory than ever before. Every step could be the last. Every word could betray him. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the camp cloaked in shadow. The British fires flickered across the earthworks, casting long, dancing shadows that hid danger and revealed nothing. James adjusted the simple cloth he wore, wiped the sweat from his brow, and forced himself to breathe slowly. Calmness was as important as speed. Confidence could be deadly, but hesitation would kill him faster. Captain Haynes's last instructions replayed in his mind. Trust no one. Observe everything. Memorize every number, every route, every conversation. Stick to your story. Blend in. Live or die by your wits alone. James had practiced this for weeks. He had rehearsed, memorized, planned, and survived tests that would have crushed lesser men. But tonight, the enemy was not just watching. They were everywhere. British officers moved like predators. Sentries scanned every path. Loyalist informants lurked. One wrong move, one glance that lingered too long, and he would hang from a rope before dawn. Yet James did not falter. The boy who had grown up under the watchful eyes of overseers, the boy who had learned to hide his mind and obey without question, was now a man who could manipulate what others believed about him. That skill had become a weapon. Tonight, it would be tested like never before. He approached the inner perimeter of the camp, carrying a bucket of water. Soldiers glanced at him, nodding. He was careful to bow slightly, to keep his eyes lowered, to appear grateful for their acknowledgement. Every step, every gesture, every shadowed corner was rehearsed, measured, precise. Then he saw it. The officer's tent, larger than any he had passed before, surrounded by guards, littered with maps, orders, and the smell of gunpowder. This was the heart of enemy operations. And he would enter it. James slowed his breathing and reminded himself of the story he carried in his head. He was a runaway slave, eager to serve the British, desperate for freedom, simple but hard-working. He was nothing more than that to them. And yet, inside, he was everything they could not see. Inside the tent, officers argued over supply routes, reinforcements, and the Continental Force's movements. James listened, memorized, and filed away every word. The numbers, the schedules, the vulnerabilities, the locations, everything mattered. If he could recall it perfectly, Lafayette could strike before the British realized their mistake. Hours passed, each moment stretching like a lifetime. James delivered water, cleaned utensils, and moved quietly, always observing. He memorized patterns of behavior, the tone of commands, the cadence of messages. Every gesture, every phrase became part of the mental map he carried with him. Outside, the wind carried faint sounds of distant cannon fire and shouting. The war was alive, brutal, and unforgiving. And James, invisible to all, was shaping it. A British officer approached him suddenly, questioning a minor detail about a wagon delivery. James responded calmly, naturally. His heart raced, but his voice was steady, his expression obedient. He had learned to survive scrutiny, to answer in a way that seemed natural, spontaneous, yet carefully rehearsed. The officer nodded, satisfied, and returned to his duties. James exhaled slowly. One test had passed, but the real challenge was still ahead. That night, he returned to the rendezvous point, delivering the day's intelligence to a waiting courier. Lafayette had arranged these secret meetings, but James often wondered if he could trust anyone fully. Survival depended on careful observation, patience, and discretion. One misstep could mean death. As he walked back to the temporary shelter, James reflected on the strange balance of power he now carried. He was a slave in a world that would not acknowledge his value. Yet his mind had become a weapon more deadly than any musket or cannon. He could alter the course of battles, save lives, and influence generals, all while remaining unseen, unacknowledged, invisible. The next morning, James was tasked with delivering a message to a British supply officer in the town outside the fortifications. This required venturing even further, mingling with loyalist civilians, and pretending to be desperate for British favor. Every word, every gesture, every pause had to be convincing. He walked the narrow streets, blending with vendors, laborers, and other runaways. His story was consistent, his gratitude believable, his fear genuine but controlled. And all the while, he memorized every detail. The locations of warehouses, the rotation of guards, the number of wagons, and the conversations he overheard became another layer of intelligence stored in his mind. James understood one truth more clearly than ever. Spies were alone in ways soldiers were not. There was no backup, no reinforcements, no trial if caught. Death was immediate and merciless. Every step had to be calculated, every interaction monitored. Fear was a constant companion, but so was purpose. By the end of the day, he had gathered information that could disrupt a major British supply line. Lafayette would act on it, but James would never be named in dispatches or praised in letters. He would remain invisible, a shadow shaping history from behind enemy lines. Night fell again, and James found himself staring at the stars, thinking of his mother, Lafayette, and the long road he had traveled from the Armistead plantation to the heart of British operations. His mind carried secrets that could win battles, but he carried them alone. He had become something more than a slave. He had become a ghost walking among enemies, turning fear into power, obedience into influence, and invisibility into a weapon. And the most dangerous part of all was just beginning. The British were not careless. They were cunning, ruthless, and suspicious. One mistake, one inconsistency, could cost James his life. Every day was a test, every step a calculation, every word a gamble. And yet, he pressed forward, driven by a sense of purpose that could not be denied. If you want to see how James continues to navigate the deadliest intelligence operations, survive close calls, and influence the course of the American Revolution, make sure to subscribe, share this story, and leave your thoughts in the comments. History tried to forget him, but we will not. If you like, I can create part 6 next, where James faces his first life-threatening exposure inside the British headquarters, heightening suspense and showing his intelligence in action. Do you want me to continue with part 6 now? Part 6. The Price of Secrets. James had learned to move unseen, to speak carefully, and to carry entire battles in his mind. But nothing could prepare him for the night when a single mistake would have meant death. That night, he learned that even the invisible can be hunted, and the consequences of being discovered were immediate, brutal, and absolute. He had entered the British command tent under the guise of delivering fresh water. Officers were clustered around a large map, red and blue markers showing positions of troops, supply lines, and artillery. James memorized every detail while appearing to sweep the floor, refill cups, and adjust the linen cloths. Then it happened. A British officer, younger, sharper, more suspicious than the others, paused and studied James for a long moment. His gaze lingered, calculating, probing, searching for inconsistency. James froze, forcing his mind into calm. "Where do you really come from?" the officer asked, voice quiet but sharp. "Armistead Plantation, New Kent County, sir. Master was planning to sell some of us. I thought I might be better off with His Majesty's army." The officer tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "What makes you think we would trust you?" James felt sweat trickle down his back, but he held his composure. He lowered his eyes, adjusted his posture, and allowed a small, respectful smile. "I would do anything to prove my loyalty, sir." "Anything." The officer stared a moment longer and finally nodded. James exhaled silently. One heartbeat could have ended it all. Later, he slipped outside, heart hammering, to report the day's observations to a courier waiting in the shadows. His memory had saved him, but he knew the danger was far from over. Every secret he carried was a double-edged sword. One misstep, one careless word, one unnoticed gesture, and all his careful planning would fail. The following days brought more opportunities, and more risks. James witnessed British officers move supplies, organize patrols, and debate the timing of attacks. He memorized schedules, troop numbers, and weaknesses in fortifications. Every day, he walked among men trained to detect deception, carrying secrets that could change the war. But espionage was not just about observing. It was about manipulating perception. James had to make himself indispensable yet invisible. He had to appear helpful but not threatening. Grateful but not cunning. Simple but competent. Every detail mattered. One afternoon, James overheard a plan that could cost hundreds of Continental soldiers their lives. British reinforcements would strike a supply depot that Lafayette's men were counting on. The timing was precise, the route exposed, and the opportunity to act urgent. James memorized every word, encoded every number, every position, and every movement in his mind. At night, he met with a courier under a tree on the outskirts of the camp. He recited the details, word for word, and watched the courier disappear into the darkness with the information. This intelligence could allow Lafayette to intercept the reinforcements and prevent disaster. James had done his part, unseen, unheard, yet indispensable. Sleep was brief, if it came at all. James lay on the hard ground, thinking of his mother's advice, of Lafayette's trust, and of the life he had left behind. The plantation, the overseers, the routine of labor, all seemed distant, unreal. He had entered a world where knowledge was power, invisibility was safety, and mistakes were fatal. The next morning, James received a new challenge. He was to deliver intelligence to a different section of the British camp, one far more heavily guarded and observed. Any misstep could result in immediate capture. He walked carefully through the camp, blending with laborers, sweeping courtyards, and carrying buckets. Every guard, every officer, every passerby was observed, remembered, catalogued in his mind. He could feel their eyes, their suspicion, their expectations. And he adapted, changing the angle of his gaze, the cadence of his steps, the tilt of his head. Inside the officer's tent, he overheard orders for troop rotations, the arrival of additional supplies, and a planned raid on a nearby village. Each detail could influence Lafayette's strategy, saving lives and shaping the course of the war. He memorized maps, numbers, and instructions, filing them mentally in the compartments he had created. On his way out, an officer called him over for a question. James froze for a heartbeat, recalling every word of his rehearsed cover story. "I am grateful for your protection, sir. I only want to serve," he said, voice calm, posture humble. The officer nodded and returned to his maps. James exhaled quietly. Another test passed. That night, in a secluded spot, he met the courier again, delivering a full report of troop positions, supply movements, and planned attacks. The courier nodded, impressed by the detail and accuracy. James realized that his invisible work was becoming critical to Lafayette's operations. The war was being shaped by a young slave who would never see recognition, who would never be celebrated, yet whose mind could turn the tide. But the danger was relentless. Suspicion lingered like a shadow. Random questions, brief glances, and minor inconsistencies could expose him. Every step had to be measured, every word considered, every glance calculated. Fear was constant, but it had become a tool, sharpening him, keeping him alive. James realized that his life had become a balancing act on a knife's edge. Every observation mattered. Every memory was a weapon. And yet, the line between life and death was thinner than he had ever known. One night, as he returned from a supply run, he stumbled upon a captured Continental soldier being interrogated. The man's cries echoed in the darkness, a brutal reminder of the consequences of failure. James shivered, understanding that one misstep, one hesitation, could have been him. Fear gripped him, but he pushed it down, remembering Lafayette's words, "Courage is not the absence of fear but the mastery of it." James had become more than a slave. He had become a ghost walking among enemies, invisible yet powerful. His mind, once hidden to survive slavery, was now the sharpest weapon in Lafayette's arsenal. And yet, every day reminded him that invisibility was fragile. The British were clever, ruthless, and suspicious. One mistake could unravel everything. And the most dangerous test was still to come. If you want to see how James survives his closest brush with exposure, uncovers critical intelligence that could turn the war, and risks everything to protect his secret identity, subscribe, share this story, and leave your thoughts in the comments. James's story is history's secret, but it will not be forgotten. I can create part 7 next, where James faces a life or death exposure that could reveal him to the British, escalating tension and suspense for your audience. Do you want me to continue with part 7 now? Part 7. The moment of exposure. James had walked through shadows so long that darkness felt like a friend. But tonight, the darkness became a trap. Every spy knows that one careless glance, one misplaced word, can unravel years of preparation. James was about to discover just how close death could be when all seemed secure. It began with a routine observation. British officers were meeting in a tent near the center of the fortifications. James, carrying a bucket of water, was supposed to overhear, memorize, and retreat quietly. Everything was calculated, rehearsed, safe, or so he thought. A sudden noise, a dropped tool, the rustle of a uniform, made a British officer look up sharply. His eyes met James's for just a heartbeat, and in that instant, the air grew heavy with danger. James froze, feeling the seconds stretch into eternity. One wrong move, one twitch of a muscle, and he would hang before dawn. He lowered his gaze, adjusted his posture, and whispered, "I am just a runaway seeking freedom." "Grateful, sir. Nothing more." The officer frowned but returned to the meeting. James exhaled silently. He had survived, but he knew the British were watching closer now. Inside the tent, the officers discussed troop reinforcements, supply movements, and a raid on a nearby village. James memorized every word, every number, every map marking. He stored it in his mind, creating mental compartments for each detail. These were the secrets that could decide battles, but they were also the same secrets that could end his life instantly. On his way out, he passed another officer who was new to the camp. The man studied him carefully, suspicious, asking questions in a casual tone. "Where are you from? What do you know about local roads? What news do you bring?" James answered carefully, rehearsed, confident, blending truth and omission. The officer nodded slowly and walked away, unconvinced but willing to let him pass. James's heart raced. Each encounter was a test, and survival required perfection. That night, he met the courier in a secluded clearing. The full intelligence report was delivered, including troop numbers, positions, and planned movements. The courier nodded, impressed by the accuracy and detail. James realized that his invisible work was now crucial to Lafayette's strategy. Without him, soldiers could die unnecessarily. With him, the Continental Army could strike decisively. But invisibility was fragile. That night, James felt eyes on him, shadows moving where there should have been none. Fear crept in like a living thing. He remembered his mother's advice: keep your mind hidden, keep it sharp. He carried her voice like armor. Fear was a tool, and he would use it. The next morning, James was assigned a more dangerous task. A British supply officer was to move a convoy through enemy territory. James was to deliver an observation report while mingling among loyalist civilians. One mistake could betray him. One slip, one misstep, and his life would end. The road was long and treacherous. Farmers, refugees, and soldiers all moved through it. James blended in, observing patterns of guards, noting numbers of wagons, supplies, and the conversations of officers. Every detail mattered. His memory was no longer just a skill, it was survival. As he approached the British supply point, a young soldier stepped forward. His eyes were sharp, suspicious. He asked questions in a tone designed to catch any inconsistencies. James answered carefully, mixing truth with strategic omissions. His voice did not waver, his hands remained steady, his posture obedient. The soldier studied him, frowning, then stepped aside. James exhaled, silently thanking every lesson his mother had taught him about reading people and hiding thoughts. Inside the supply area, James observed warehouses, the rotation of guards, and the timing of convoys. He memorized it all. Every crate, every wagon, every route became part of the mental map he carried. Each observation could prevent disaster for Lafayette's forces or turn the tide of a critical operation. But even as he worked, James knew he was being watched more closely than ever. The British intelligence officers were clever, trained to detect deception, and increasingly suspicious of his presence. One mistake, one hesitation, and he could be caught. That evening, James returned to a hiding spot outside the British camp. He met the courier and delivered the intelligence. The courier's expression was serious. He understood the stakes. Every report James brought was vital, but it also painted a target on his back. James nodded silently, understanding the unspoken truth. One wrong step could end everything. Lying in the darkness, James thought of Lafayette, of his mother, and of the Armistead plantation. He had left everything behind: home, family, the life he knew. Yet in its place, he had gained power, knowledge, and responsibility. He had become invisible, essential, and deadly. But the cost was high. Fear was constant, exhaustion unrelenting, and exposure always a heartbeat away. James had walked the line between life and death so many times that it had become almost normal. Almost. Tomorrow would bring new dangers. New tests of courage, memory, and cunning. The British were clever, suspicious, and ruthless. They were hunting ghosts in the form of men like James. And he knew one day the wrong person would notice, and the consequences would be final. Yet James pressed on. Every observation, every secret, every step in enemy territory was shaping the war. His mind had become a weapon sharper than any sword, his courage forged in fear. He was invisible, forgotten by history, yet essential to it. If you want to see how James survives his most dangerous encounter yet, uncovers intelligence that could change the outcome of a battle, and risks everything to remain invisible among the British, subscribe, share this story, and leave your thoughts in the comments. The secrets James carries are history's ghosts, but we will not let them be forgotten. If you want, I can continue with part 8 next, where James faces his first near-capture moment and must rely on his full wit to escape, increasing suspense and tension. Do you want me to write part 8 now? Part 8. The Edge of Discovery. James had walked among enemies for months, carrying secrets that could turn the tide of the war. He had become invisible, a ghost who passed through British camps unnoticed. But one night, invisibility faltered, and the danger he had always imagined became real. It began quietly. He was delivering intelligence from a British officer who trusted him enough to share plans about troop movements and supplies. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind clouds. James moved cautiously along a narrow path near the perimeter of the camp. Every sound, every shadow, every rustle of leaves put him on edge. Then he heard it, the snap of a branch underfoot, sharp and unnatural. James froze, heart hammering. Footsteps approached. He pressed himself against a tree, holding his breath, counting silently. 2 figures appeared, British soldiers, lanterns swinging, eyes scanning the darkness. James had never been more aware of his own body. Every muscle, every heartbeat, every shallow breath became a weapon of survival. The soldiers moved closer, their voices low but clear. "Stop there," one said. "Identify yourself." James stepped forward slowly, keeping his hands visible, showing submission. "I am just a runaway seeking freedom, sir," he said, voice calm, posture humble. "I wish to serve His Majesty, nothing more." The soldiers exchanged glances. One stepped closer, squinting in the darkness. "Where are you from?" he asked. James held his tongue, carefully repeating his rehearsed story. "Armistead Plantation, New Kent County, sir. Master was planning to sell some of us, and I thought I would be safer with your army." The officer circled him, eyes sharp, searching for any sign of deception. James felt sweat trickling down his back, fear like fire in his chest. Every lesson, every drill, every mental exercise he had learned from Captain Haynes flashed through his mind. He had to appear natural, spontaneous, grateful, harmless. Finally, the officer nodded, though his gaze lingered. Move along, he said, voice low but firm. James exhaled silently, relief washing over him, but he knew this was only a temporary escape. One day, luck might not be enough. The following days tested him further. He entered the British camp during the busiest hours, memorizing the positions of soldiers, supply wagons, and artillery. Every officer he encountered was a potential threat, every question a possible trap. But James had learned to blend observation with performance. He carried fear like a shield, awareness like a blade. One afternoon, he discovered a new danger. A British officer had been transferred to the camp, one known for interrogating runaway slaves with brutal efficiency. James observed from a distance, noting the officer's methods, sharp questions, subtle threats, constant tests for inconsistencies. The man was clever, patient, and ruthless. James realized that his skills alone might not be enough. He needed to adapt, to improvise, to anticipate the officer's moves before they happened. The mental exercises from Haynes became his lifeline. Every observation was encoded, every conversation remembered, every interaction a rehearsal for survival. That night, James met the courier under the same secluded tree. He delivered the intelligence on troop movements, supply lines, and officer plans. The courier's face was grave. The British were becoming more alert, more suspicious, and the risk of exposure was growing. James nodded silently. He understood. Every success carried a shadow, and the shadow was growing longer. In the following days, James faced moments where a single misstep would have meant death. A British officer asked a question he had not rehearsed. James paused, mind racing. He improvised, blending truth and omission, creating a believable story on the spot. The officer studied him, then moved on. He realized something crucial. Espionage was not just memorization, it was improvisation, intuition, and courage. He was no longer a passive observer. He was a participant in a dangerous game where every detail mattered, every decision could be fatal, and invisibility was both a weapon and a fragile shield. The turning point came when James overheard a plan for a major raid on a nearby village. Hundreds of Continental sympathizers were in danger, and if the information reached Lafayette in time, lives could be saved. James memorized the details, counting soldiers, wagons, supplies, and timing. Every number, every position, every word was stored in his mind with precision. Delivering this information required him to pass directly through a heavily guarded checkpoint. He approached with a calm he did not feel, posture and voice rehearsed to perfection. A British officer challenged him, asking questions, pressing for details, testing his consistency. James answered carefully, improvising where necessary, blending truth with deception. He made it through, heart racing, body tense. That night, he delivered the intelligence to the courier, who nodded with a mixture of respect and concern. The report could save hundreds of lives, but it also meant that James had walked the edge of discovery and survived. As he lay down that night, James reflected on what he had become. He was no longer simply a slave, no longer merely a servant to survive. He was a spy, a keeper of secrets, a ghost who shaped history without being seen. But he also knew the truth. Invisibility was fragile, and exposure could come at any moment. James thought of Lafayette, who trusted him with the fate of men and battles. He thought of his mother, whose advice had prepared him for this life. And he thought of the plantation, the life he had left behind, the chains he would never wear again in spirit, if not in law. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, greater risks, and possibly the first real test of his skill and courage. He would have to rely on every lesson, every instinct, every secret he carried in his mind. If you want to see how James faces his most dangerous challenge yet, survives near capture, and delivers intelligence that could change the outcome of the war, subscribe, share this story, and leave your thoughts in the comments. History has forgotten him, but we will not. I can continue with part 9 next, where James's intelligence directly influences a key battle and his actions place him in the heart of life-threatening danger. Do you want me to write part 9 now? Part 9. The Battle of Secrets. James had walked in shadows for months, invisible and silent, a ghost carrying secrets that could save or doom hundreds of men. But nothing in his life had prepared him for what was about to happen. Tonight, the war and death would meet him face to face. It began before dawn. The sky was gray, heavy clouds blocking the first hints of sunlight. James moved carefully along the edge of the Continental camp, clutching the intelligence he had memorized, troop positions, supply routes, British reinforcements. Every detail mattered. One mistake, one slip, and the consequences would be fatal. He had been instructed to deliver the information directly to Lafayette before the planned attack. The general needed precise knowledge of enemy positions to plan the Battle of Virginia, a decisive engagement that could change the course of the revolution. As James approached Lafayette's tent, he noticed movement near the British lines. Scouts, patrolling, searching for signs of spies or runaways. His heart hammered, sweat running down his back, but he walked as if he were merely a servant carrying a routine message. The courier had warned him. The British were more alert than ever. They had noticed unusual activity around supply points, more runaways seeking freedom, and they suspected there was a spy in their midst. James's every step now carried the weight of life and death. Inside Lafayette's tent, the French general examined the maps James had memorized. He traced routes with his finger, nodding, absorbing the details. James recited troop counts, the timing of reinforcements, supply wagons, and artillery positions. Every number, every position, every note had to be accurate. Lafayette's eyes met James's, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The stakes were high. If this intelligence failed, men would die unnecessarily, and the chance to strike a decisive blow could vanish. That afternoon, the Continental forces moved into position, guided by the information James had delivered. He was not on the battlefield. His role was invisible, but every decision, every placement, every maneuver relied on him. It was a strange and dangerous kind of power. But James did not remain safe. A British officer, suspicious and clever, had observed unusual movement near supply routes. Reports of a possible spy had reached him, and he set out to investigate. James was walking along a narrow path near the camp when he spotted the officer and two soldiers approaching, their eyes sharp, their posture aggressive. He froze, weighing options, remembering every lesson from Haynes. There was no running, no hiding. The British officer would see him immediately. James adopted the pose he had perfected, submissive but alert, humble but competent. "I am just a runaway seeking freedom," he said, voice steady. "I mean no trouble, sir." The officer studied him for what felt like an eternity. Questions followed. "Where are you from? What news do you bring? Why are you moving at this hour?" James answered carefully, truth and omission blended seamlessly, improvising details without breaking the story. The officer's gaze narrowed, suspicion lingering, but eventually he stepped aside. James moved on, heart racing, the danger passing but not gone. As night fell, James returned to a secluded spot to meet the courier again. He handed over the latest observations from the day, including British patrol movements and officer conversations. The courier nodded gravely. Every report James delivered was shaping the battle. Without him, soldiers could die. With him, the Continental Army could strike decisively. The battle began at first light the following morning. Cannons roared, muskets fired, and chaos engulfed the landscape. James was not on the field, but he watched from a safe distance, knowing every maneuver had been influenced by the intelligence he had gathered. When Lafayette ordered a flank maneuver, it was based entirely on James's reports. From the tree line, James observed as Continental forces surrounded the British positions, catching them off guard. The enemy was outnumbered in the wrong place at the wrong time. Victory depended on speed, surprise, and accurate information, all things James had provided. Yet even in the midst of triumph, danger remained. One British officer spotted unusual movement along the tree line. James ducked behind a fallen log, holding his breath, heart racing. The officer searched, moving slowly, methodically, scanning for any sign of spies. James had to remain perfectly still, blending into shadows, invisible but present. Hours passed, and finally the officer moved on. James exhaled slowly, relief flooding his body. He had survived again, narrowly, walking the line between life and death. The battle raged, and by nightfall, the British forces were retreating, their lines broken, their morale shattered. Lafayette's gamble, guided by James's intelligence, had succeeded. But victory did not erase the danger. James had seen how close exposure could come, how fragile invisibility was, and how much depended on his mind, his courage, and his careful observation. The war was far from over, but he had proven that even the unseen could change history. Lying that night under the stars, James thought of everything he had lost: his mother, his childhood, the plantation he had left behind. He also thought of what he had gained: skill, purpose, and a place in history that would never acknowledge him. Yet he would continue, because invisibility was both his weapon and his burden. If you want to discover how James faces the final, most dangerous moments of his mission, how he risks everything for freedom, and how history almost forgot the man who changed its course, subscribe, share this story, and leave your thoughts in the comments. The shadows carry the truth, and we will not let it fade. I can now write part 10, the final chapter, where James faces the ultimate test. His actions decide a pivotal moment in the war, and the story of his invisibility and forgotten heroism concludes. Do you want me to write part 10 now? Part 10. Forgotten Hero. James had survived months of danger, walking among enemies, carrying secrets that could kill or save hundreds. But the final test was approaching, one that would determine not just the outcome of a battle, but the fate of the war itself. It was late October 1781. The air in Virginia carried a sharp chill, and the trees were almost bare, their leaves scattered across the ground like forgotten memories. James had returned from another mission inside the British lines, delivering intelligence about troop reinforcements and supply movements. Lafayette had reviewed his reports and nodded quietly. Everything depended on timing. Everything depended on him. The Continental Army was preparing a decisive assault. The British held a fortified position at Yorktown. If Lafayette and General Washington could trap them there, the war could end. But the British were cautious, alert for spies, ready to strike at anyone who appeared suspicious. James's next task would be his most dangerous. He would cross enemy lines one last time, directly into the heart of the British encampment. James knew every step could be fatal. Every soldier who glanced his way, every officer who asked a question, could unravel months of careful planning. He had practiced, rehearsed, and memorized every detail, but improvisation would be necessary. The British were clever, and their suspicion was rising. He moved at night, shadowing the trees, silent as the wind. The British camp stretched ahead like a fortress. Lanterns glowed, guards patrolled, and the air smelled of smoke and gunpowder. James reminded himself of everything Haynes had taught him. Remain calm, blend in, answer as expected, and never reveal what you truly know. A sentry challenged him, voice sharp. I am just a runaway seeking freedom, James said, calm and steady. I wish to serve His Majesty. The soldier scrutinized him, then nodded, letting him pass. James felt his heart hammer but did not falter. Every step now was measured, precise, a delicate dance on the edge of death. Inside the camp, he overheard British officers discussing troop movements, fortifications, and planned attacks. He memorized every detail, encoding numbers and locations into mental maps, recalling the position of cannons, supply wagons, and reinforcements. One small error could cost hundreds of lives. He reminded himself, invisibility is your shield. Your mind is your weapon. Hours later, he returned to a hidden location to relay the information to a courier who would take it to Lafayette. The knowledge he carried would allow the Continental Army to coordinate the final attack, to surround the British, and to force a surrender without unnecessary loss of life. Every detail, every number, every observation mattered. The day of the battle arrived. James watched from the tree line as Continental forces moved with precision, guided entirely by the intelligence he had provided. Artillery struck, soldiers maneuvered, and the British lines wavered. For the first time in his life, James witnessed the results of his hidden work unfold on a massive scale. And yet, invisibility remained his constant companion. He could not join the soldiers on the field, could not claim glory or recognition. His contributions were vital, but unacknowledged. The world would remember the generals and the victories, but not the man in the shadows who had carried the knowledge that made them possible. As the battle ended and the British surrendered, James felt a strange mix of triumph and emptiness. Victory had been achieved, history had been changed, but he remained unseen. He returned to Lafayette's camp, where the general offered a quiet nod of respect. You have done more than most men can imagine, Lafayette said. You have shaped history. James nodded, understanding fully. Recognition was not part of this life. Survival, service, and impact without notice were what defined him. He had risked everything, walked among death, and helped win a war for freedom while his own freedom remained uncertain. After the war, James returned to the Armistead plantation. Freedom was not yet guaranteed. Some masters kept their slaves despite promises of liberty, some laws prevented immediate emancipation. But James had learned something more important than legal freedom. He had power, knowledge, and the experience that no one could ever take from him. He lived quietly, invisible, observing, remembering. His role in history was buried in the reports of generals, in letters that few would read, in documents that faded into archives. Yet every victory, every saved life, every turning point of the war carried his fingerprints. He was a ghost who shaped the world, and the world forgot him. In the evenings, James would think of the lessons his mother had taught him: keep your mind hidden, anticipate danger, survive with intelligence. They had carried him this far, through danger and fear, through a world that refused to see him. Now he understood their full weight. Survival was more than life itself, it was the power to act when no one else could. James died years later, quiet, unseen, unremembered by most, but the impact of his life persisted. The war ended, the nation was born, and his contribution remained invisible to history. Yet in secret reports, in Lafayette's letters, in the margins of maps, his work remained, a silent testament to courage and intelligence that could operate in the shadows. The story of James reminds us that history is often written by those in power, leaving out those who risk everything in silence. Sometimes the most extraordinary acts are performed by people who will never receive recognition. He changed the course of a nation, yet the world did not know his name. And that is the truth about those who walk between worlds, unseen, unacknowledged, and indispensable. Their courage shapes history quietly, invisibly, and with precision that only a sharp mind can achieve. If you want to honor the hidden heroes, the men and women whose names history forgot, subscribe, share this story, and leave your thoughts in the comments. The shadows carry their truth, and it deserves to be remembered.